The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready to capture any glimpse of royal life. Among the crowd stood 8-year-old Emma Chen, her small hand clutched tightly in her grandmother's weathered palm. The elderly woman had saved for months to bring her granddaughter to London, fulfilling a promise made on the child's birthday. Emma's eyes sparkled with wonder as she pressed her face against the cool metal bars, trying to peer through the gaps at the magnificent palace beyond. Her grandmother, Mrs. Chen, smiled warmly at her granddaughter's excitement, remembering her own childhood dreams of seeing such grandeur. The old woman had immigrated to England decades ago, working long hours in a textile factory to build a better life for her family. The crowd grew thicker as the morning progressed, with tourists from around the world jostling for the best viewing positions. Street vendors called out their wares, selling miniature Union Jack flags and postcards featuring the royal family. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, as word had spread that there might be a royal appearance later in the day. Standing near the back of the crowd was Marcus Webb, a middle-aged businessman whose expensive suit and polished shoes marked him as someone of means. His face wore a permanent scowl, and his eyes darted impatiently at his gold watch every few minutes. He had been trying to push through the crowd to reach a business meeting in the nearby government district, but the mass of tourists had blocked his usual shortcut. Marcus felt his blood pressure rising as he found himself trapped behind what he considered a wall of common people. His important meeting with potential investors was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and he prided himself on punctuality. The irony that his own wealth had come from inherited family money rather than personal achievement was lost on him as he looked down on the working-class families around him. Emma's grandmother had brought a small thermos of tea and some homemade biscuits, which she shared with her granddaughter as they waited. The child chattered excitedly about the palace, asking countless questions about the queen and whether they might see the famous red-coated guards. Her innocent enthusiasm brought smiles to the faces of nearby tourists, who found themselves charmed by her genuine excitement. As the crowd shifted and swayed, Emma accidentally dropped her small stuffed rabbit, a treasured companion that had been with her since infancy. The toy fell to the ground and was immediately kicked about by the shuffling feet of the crowd. Without thinking, the little girl broke free from her grandmother's grip and dove between the legs of the adults, desperately trying to retrieve her beloved toy. The sudden movement caught Marcus off guard as he was checking his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. He felt something bump against his legs and looked down to see Emma crawling near his feet, reaching for her rabbit. His expensive leather shoes had accidentally stepped on the toy's ear, and the child was tugging gently to free it. Marcus's already frayed temper snapped completely. Here was yet another obstacle preventing him from reaching his meeting on time. Without thinking, he raised his hand and struck the child across her small shoulder, the force of the blow sending Emma tumbling backward onto the hard pavement. The little girl's cry of pain and shock pierced through the general noise of the crowd like a knife. Her grandmother's scream of horror followed immediately after, as the elderly woman pushed through the mass of people to reach her fallen granddaughter. Emma's face was streaked with tears, her knee scraped from the fall and her small body trembling from the unexpected violence. The crowd around them fell into stunned silence, many people too shocked to immediately process what they had witnessed. A few tourists began reaching for their phones, some to call for help and others to document the incident. The contrast between the child's innocent presence and the man's brutal action created a scene that would be burned into the memory of everyone present. Mrs. Chen dropped to her knees beside Emma, her own hands shaking as she gathered her granddaughter into her arms. The old woman's limited English failed her in this moment of crisis, and she could only repeat, "Help, please help," while rocking the crying child. The stuffed rabbit lay forgotten on the ground, now dirty and torn from being trampled. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, perhaps realizing the gravity of what he had done, but his face showed no remorse. Instead, he seemed more concerned about the attention the incident had drawn and how it might affect his reputation. He straightened his tie and looked around nervously, as if calculating whether he could simply walk away from the scene. Some tourists began to form a protective circle around the grandmother and child, while others started confronting Marcus about his actions. Voices rose in multiple languages, all expressing the same sentiment of outrage and disbelief. The morning that had started with such promise and excitement had suddenly turned into a nightmare that no one present would ever forget. The palace, gates which had seemed so welcoming and magical just moments before, now loomed like silent witnesses to an act of senseless cruelty. The grandeur of the royal residence provided a stark backdrop to the very human drama unfolding in its shadow, where wealth and privilege had collided with innocence and vulnerability in the most disturbing way possible. As Emma's sobs echoed, across the courtyard mixing with her grandmother's desperate pleas for help, the stage was set for an intervention that would challenge protocol, test loyalties, and ultimately restore faith in human decency. The morning sun continued to shine down on the scene, but for those present, the day had already been forever changed by one man's moment of inexcusable violence against a defenseless child. Inside the palace grounds, Sergeant James Harrison stood at his post near the main gate, his red uniform pristine and his bearing military straight. At 32 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 8 years, following a distinguished career in the British Army that included 2 tours of duty overseas. His dedication to duty was legendary among his peers, and he had never once been reprimanded for breaking protocol. James had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester, where his father worked in a factory, and his mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. He understood the value of hard work and the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their social status. These values had been instilled in him from childhood and had guided him throughout his military career. The morning had been routine until the commotion outside the gates caught his attention. From his position, James could see the crowd of tourists, but the thick iron bars in the distance made it difficult to discern exactly what was happening. However, the change in the crowd's behavior was unmistakable. The cheerful chatter had been replaced by angry voices and what sounded like someone crying. James's training had taught him to remain focused on his assigned duties, regardless of distractions. Palace guards were expected to maintain their positions and composure under all circumstances, serving as symbols of British stability and discipline. They were not supposed to abandon their posts even in emergencies unless specifically ordered to do so by a superior officer. But something about the sounds coming from the crowd troubled James deeply. His experience as a soldier had given him an instinct for recognizing when someone was truly in distress, and every fiber of his being told him that this was such a moment. The crying he heard was not the typical complaint of a frustrated tourist, but the genuine anguish of someone who had been hurt. Through the gaps in the gate, James caught glimpses of the scene unfolding before him. He saw the elderly Asian woman, on her knees cradling what appeared to be a small child. He witnessed the angry gestures of the surrounding crowd as they pointed at a well-dressed man who seemed to be the center of their fury. The body language of everyone involved painted a clear picture of injustice and suffering. James felt his hands clench into fists inside his white gloves as he recognized the classic signs of a situation where someone in power had abused someone vulnerable. His military training in conflict zones had shown him too many examples of such scenarios, and they always triggered his protective instincts. The sight of a child in distress was particularly difficult for him to ignore, as he himself was a father to a 6-year-old daughter. The crowd's anger was growing more intense by the minute, and James could see that the situation was escalating rapidly. Some tourists were pulling out their phones to record the incident, while others were trying to physically confront the man who had apparently struck the child. The potential for the situation to spiral completely out of control was becoming increasingly clear. Palace protocol was explicit about guards maintaining their positions and not interfering in civilian matters outside the gates. Any intervention was supposed to go through proper channels, with requests for assistance directed to the Metropolitan Police, who patrolled the area around the palace. Guards were trained to be living statues, symbols of unwavering duty who remained unmoved by external events. But James had also sworn an oath to protect the innocent and uphold justice, values that went beyond his specific duties as a palace guard. The conflict between his official responsibilities and his moral obligations created a tension that grew stronger with each passing second. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air, as he struggled with a decision that could end his career. The crying of the child seemed to pierce through all other sounds, reaching James's ears like a direct appeal for help. He thought of his own daughter, Sarah, and how he would want someone to intervene if she were ever in such a situation. The image of Emma's small, frightened face became intertwined in his mind with memories of his own child, making the decision increasingly difficult to avoid. Captain Morrison, James's commanding officer, was conducting an inspection on the other side of the palace grounds and would not return for at least 30 minutes. The nearest police constable was dealing with a minor traffic incident several blocks away. In this critical moment, James realized that he might be the only person in a position to provide immediate, effective help to the distressed child and her grandmother. The well-dressed man who had struck Emma was now attempting to push through the crowd, apparently trying to escape the scene before authorities could arrive. His obvious guilt and cowardice only reinforced James's growing conviction that intervention was necessary. The sight of the perpetrator trying to flee while his victim remained on the ground in pain was more than the guard's sense of justice could bear. James glanced at his fellow guard, Private Collins, who was stationed at the adjacent post. The younger man's face showed his own internal struggle as he witnessed the unfolding drama. Collins was relatively new to the position and looked to James for guidance, but protocol demanded that both men maintain their posts regardless of the circumstances outside the gates. The moment of decision had arrived. James could either follow protocol and remain at his post, knowing that a child was suffering and her attacker might escape justice, or he could act according to his conscience and face the consequences of abandoning his duties. The weight of his military medals, earned through acts of courage and moral clarity, seemed to press against his chest as he contemplated the choice before him. In that instant, James made a decision that would change not only his own life but also restore faith in human decency for everyone who witnessed what happened next. The values his parents had taught him, the oath he had sworn as a soldier, and his instincts as a father all aligned to push him toward action, regardless of the personal cost he might face for breaking protocol. James took a deep breath and stepped away from his post, his polished boots clicking against the stone pavement as he moved toward the palace gates. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in his own ears, each step representing a deliberate choice to prioritize human compassion over military protocol. His fellow guard, Private Collins, stared in shock as he watched his senior officer abandon the position they were sworn to maintain. The heavy iron gates that separated the palace grounds from the public street had always seemed like a barrier between two different worlds. On one side lay duty, tradition, and unwavering adherence to rules. On the other side was the messy, unpredictable reality of human life, where moral choices often defied simple regulations. As James approached the gate, he was literally and symbolically crossing from one world into the other. The crowd of tourists parted instinctively as they saw the distinctive red uniform and tall bearskin hat of a Queen's Guard approaching. Many had never seen one of the famous guards move from their posts, and the sight created a ripple of excitement and confusion that spread through the gathering. Cameras and phones turned toward James, capturing a moment that would soon be shared around the world. Emma was still crying in her grandmother's arms when James reached them, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the small family. Up close, he could see the full extent of the child's distress. Her small shoulder bore a red mark where Marcus had struck her, and her scraped knee was bleeding slightly. The stuffed rabbit lay nearby, dirty and partially torn from being trampled by the crowd. Mrs. Chen looked up at the approaching guard with a mixture of hope and confusion. Her limited English had made it difficult for her to communicate with the other tourists who had tried to help, and she wasn't sure what to expect. From this official-looking figure, the language barrier had only added to her sense of helplessness as she tried to comfort her granddaughter, while surrounded by strangers. James knelt down beside the grandmother and child, his military training allowing him to maintain composure, while his heart broke at the sight of Emma's tears. He had learned basic first aid during his service, and he could see that while the child was traumatized and hurt, her injuries were not life-threatening. However, the emotional impact of the attack was clearly severe. "It's going to be all right," James said softly, his deep voice carrying the authority of his position, but also the gentle warmth of a father. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, which he offered to Mrs. Chen to help clean Emma's scraped knee. The simple gesture broke down the formal barrier between the guard and the civilians, establishing a human connection that transcended their different roles. Marcus Webb, who had been trying to edge away from the scene, suddenly found himself face to face with the imposing figure of the Queen's Guard. At 6 feet 2 inches tall and with the bearing of a career soldier, James presented a formidable presence that made the businessman's escape route seem suddenly impossible. The contrast between Marcus's expensive suit and guilty expression and James's noble uniform and confident stance was not lost on the surrounding crowd. "Sir, I need you to remain here," James said firmly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of military authority. "The police will want to speak with you about what happened." The words were polite, but delivered with such conviction that Marcus instinctively stepped backward, his earlier bravado crumbling in the face of genuine authority. Before, the crowd around them had grown larger as word spread about the unusual sight of a palace guard intervening in a civilian matter. Tourists who had been exploring other areas of the palace grounds were drawn by the commotion, and soon a substantial gathering had formed around the central drama. The incident was being recorded on dozens of phones, ensuring that the story would spread far beyond those physically present. James turned his attention back to Emma, who had stopped crying but was still clinging tightly to her grandmother. The guard's gentle demeanor and obvious concern seemed to have a calming effect on the frightened child. He retrieved the stuffed rabbit from the ground, carefully brushing off the dirt and examining the small tear in its ear. "What's your rabbit's name?" James asked Emma, his voice soft and encouraging. The question was simple enough for the child to understand despite her limited English, and she managed to whisper, "Mr. Hop," through her remaining tears. James smiled and nodded seriously, as if he were being introduced to a very important person. "Mr. Hop looks like he's been on quite an adventure," James said, gently straightening the toy's ears. "But I think he'll be just fine after a little rest." His words were directed at Emma, but they carried a deeper message about recovery and resilience that the adults around him understood perfectly. Mrs. Chen watched this interaction with growing amazement and gratitude. The sight of this official, guardian taking time to comfort her granddaughter restored her faith in human kindness after the traumatic attack. She began to speak in broken English, trying to express her thanks, but James gestured gently that no thanks were necessary. The businessman, Marcus, was becoming increasingly agitated as he realized the gravity of his situation. What had started as a moment of uncontrolled anger was rapidly becoming a public scandal that could destroy his reputation and career. He began to speak rapidly, trying to explain or justify his actions, but his words only served to further anger the crowd of witnesses. "There's no excuse for hitting a child," James said quietly, but his words carried across the courtyard with crystal clarity. "No meeting, no appointment. Nothing is more important than treating people with basic human dignity." The statement was simple but profound, capturing the moral clarity that had driven him to abandon his post in the first place. Private Collins, still at his station but clearly torn about what to do, watched as his colleague handled the situation with a combination of military bearing and human compassion that exemplified the best qualities of service. The younger guard was learning a valuable lesson about the difference between following orders and doing what was right, even when those two things seemed to conflict. As James continued to comfort Emma and coordinate with approaching police officers, he was fully aware that his career as a palace guard might be ending. Breaking protocol was a serious offense that could result in dismissal and disgrace. However, looking at the small child who was beginning to smile again as she hugged her rescued rabbit, James felt no regret about the choice he had made. Some things were more important than rules, and protecting the innocent was one of them. The arrival of the Metropolitan Police created a new dynamic in the already charged atmosphere outside Buckingham Palace. Two constables, PC Sarah Williams and PC David Thompson, had responded to multiple phone calls from tourists reporting the assault. As they approached the scene, they were surprised to see a Queen's Guard actively involved in what appeared to be a civilian matter. P.C. Williams, a 10-year veteran of the force, immediately recognized the unusual nature of the situation. Palace guards were known for their stoic adherence to protocol, and seeing one engaged with civilians outside the gates was unprecedented in her experience. She approached James with professional courtesy, but obvious curiosity about why he had left his post. "Sergeant Harrison," James introduced himself, reading the confusion in the constable's eyes. "I witnessed an assault on this child and felt immediate intervention was necessary." His military bearing remained intact even as he explained his breach of protocol, and his clear, factual statement of events helped establish credibility with the arriving officers. Emma had calmed considerably under James's protective presence, but the sight of the police uniforms initially frightened her again. Mrs. Chen tightened her grip on her granddaughter and looked nervously between the officers and the guard who had become their unexpected protector. The language barrier made the situation more complex, as the elderly woman struggled to explain what had happened. James knelt down to Emma's level once more, his red uniform making him a striking figure against the gray pavement. "These police officers are here to help," he explained gently. "They're the good people who make sure everyone stays safe." His words, delivered with the confidence of authority but the warmth of genuine care, helped ease the child's anxiety about the new arrivals. P.C. Thompson began taking statements from witnesses while P.C. Williams focused on documenting Emma's injuries and Marcus's involvement in the incident. The businessman had grown increasingly desperate as the official response escalated, realizing that his moment of violence against a child would have serious legal consequences. His expensive lawyer would later prove unable to mitigate the damage caused by his actions in front of so many witnesses. The crowd of tourists had become an impromptu jury, with many people eager to provide statements about what they had witnessed. The diversity of the witnesses, representing different nationalities and backgrounds, only strengthened the case against Marcus. Their accounts were remarkably consistent, painting a clear picture of an unprovoked attack on an innocent child by a privileged man who felt entitled to lash out at anyone who inconvenienced him. Dr. Margaret Foster, a pediatrician who had been touring London with her family, stepped forward to offer her medical expertise. She examined Emma's injuries with professional competence while maintaining the gentle bedside manner that had made her beloved by countless young patients. Her assessment confirmed that while Emma was traumatized and bruised, she had not sustained any serious physical harm. "She'll need to be monitored for signs of emotional trauma," Dr. Foster explained to Mrs. Chen through James, who had become an informal translator, despite his own limited knowledge of the grandmother's native language. "Children are resilient, but experiences like this can have lasting effects if not properly addressed." Her words added another layer of gravity to Marcus's actions, emphasizing the potential long-term consequences of his violence. Captain Morrison's voice could be heard. Before he appeared, his authority preceding him as he made his way through the crowd of tourists and officials. James's commanding officer had been summoned when palace security realized that one of their guards had abandoned his post. The captain's face was stern and unreadable as he approached the scene, his military bearing commanding immediate respect from everyone present. "Sergeant Harrison," Captain Morrison said formally, his voice carrying the weight of military discipline, "you will return to your post immediately and report to my office when your shift ends." The order was delivered without emotion, but everyone present understood the implications. James had violated one of the fundamental rules of his position, and consequences would follow. James stood at attention and saluted his commanding officer, accepting the order without protest or excuse. However, before he could move, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. Emma broke free from her grandmother's arms and ran to James, wrapping her small arms around his legs in a gesture of pure gratitude and affection. "Thank you for helping me," she whispered, her words barely audible but carrying tremendous emotional weight. The sight of the small child clinging to the towering guard created a moment of profound humanity that touched everyone present. Even Captain Morrison's stern expression softened slightly as he witnessed the genuine connection between his subordinate and the traumatized child. Mrs. Chen approached Captain Morrison with tears in her eyes, her broken English making her words difficult to follow, but her emotion unmistakable. She pointed to James and repeated, good man," while gesturing toward her granddaughter. Other tourists joined in, creating an impromptu chorus of praise for the guard who had risked his career to help a child in need. The media had begun to arrive, drawn by social media posts and phone calls from witnesses who recognized the significance of what had occurred. Reporters and camera crews positioned themselves at the edges of the scene, capturing footage that would soon be broadcast around the world. The story of a palace guard breaking protocol to help an assaulted child was exactly the kind of human interest story that resonated with people everywhere. Marcus Webb was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit and privileged background offering no protection from the consequences of his actions. The businessman who had been so concerned about his important meeting now faced charges of assault on a minor, public humiliation, and the destruction of his carefully constructed reputation. His attempted escape had only made his guilt more obvious to everyone present. James remained at attention while Captain Morrison considered the situation before him. The captain was a career military officer who understood the importance of discipline and following orders, but he was also a man who recognized genuine heroism when he saw it. The choice between punishing a subordinate for breaking protocol and acknowledging an act of moral courage would define not only James's future, but also the values that the palace guards represented. P.C. Williams completed her documentation of the incident, ensuring that Emma's case would be properly prosecuted and that the family would receive appropriate support services. The efficiency and professionalism of the police response helped restore Mrs. Chen's confidence in the system and reinforce the message that justice would be served. As the immediate crisis passed, the broader implications of James's actions began to sink in for everyone involved. A simple moment of moral choice had created ripple effects that would touch lives far beyond the palace gates, challenging assumptions about duty, protocol, and the courage required to do what was right when it mattered most. The story of Sergeant James Harrison's intervention spread across social media platforms like wildfire, with hashtags like Sutter Palace Guard Hero and Protecting Innocents trending globally within hours of the incident. The original video footage, captured by dozens of tourists, showed the dramatic moment when the red-uniformed guard left his post to help the crying child, creating a powerful visual narrative that resonated with people worldwide. News outlets from London to Tokyo picked up the story, with many framing it as a symbol of human decency, triumphing over rigid bureaucracy. The BBC ran a special segment during their evening news, interviewing child psychology experts who praised James's quick thinking and compassionate response. CNN featured the story as their lead international piece, emphasizing how the incident had captured global attention as an example of moral courage. Inside Buckingham Palace, the unexpected media attention had created a complex situation for the royal household's administrative staff. Protocol violations by palace guards were typically handled quietly, through internal disciplinary procedures. But the public nature of this incident meant that any response would be scrutinized by millions of people around the world. The palace communications team found themselves navigating uncharted waters. Emma Chen's recovery became a secondary storyline that further humanized the incident and increased public sympathy for James's actions. Child psychologists who examined her reported that while she had been traumatized by the attack, the immediate intervention and protection provided by the palace guard had prevented more serious psychological damage. Dr. Foster's initial assessment proved accurate, as Emma showed remarkable resilience in the days following the incident. Mrs. Chen, with the help of translators and victim support services, gave a television interview expressing her profound gratitude to James Harrison. Her simple words, delivered through an interpreter but carrying obvious sincerity, moved viewers to tears as she described how the guard had restored her faith in humanity during her darkest moment. The interview was viewed millions of times and shared across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Captain Morrison found himself at the center of a media storm as reporters sought official comment on James's fate. Military discipline demanded consequences for protocol violations, but public opinion overwhelmingly supported the guard's actions. The captain, a career officer who had served with distinction in multiple conflicts, understood both the importance of rules and the necessity of moral flexibility in extraordinary circumstances. Private Collins, who had witnessed the entire incident, from his adjacent post became an unexpected spokesperson for his fellow guards. In interviews, he described James as a mentor and role model who had taught younger guards that their ultimate duty was to protect and serve, not simply to stand motionless. His words helped the public understand that James's actions reflected the best values of military service. The legal proceedings against Marcus Webb moved forward quickly, with prosecutors treating the case as a priority due to the serious nature of assaulting a child and the extensive evidence available. His defense attorneys struggled to find any justification for their client's actions, particularly given the clear video evidence and numerous witness testimonials. The businessman's reputation in London's financial district was effectively destroyed overnight. James spent the days following the incident confined to administrative duties while awaiting the formal review of his actions. He used this time to reflect on his decision and its consequences, never expressing regret for helping Emma, but acknowledging the complexity of the situation he had created. His quiet dignity during this period only increased public support for his cause. The Palace Guard Barracks became an unexpected center of solidarity as James's fellow guards rallied around their colleague. Many shared stories of their own struggles with balancing duty and conscience, creating conversations about the human dimension of their highly regimented roles. The incident had sparked a broader discussion about the meaning of service and the courage required to act on moral convictions. Letters of support poured into Buckingham Palace from around the world, with people sharing their own stories of times when others had intervened to help them or their children. Teachers used James's story in classrooms to discuss moral courage and standing up for others. The incident had become larger than just one guard's decision, evolving into a global conversation about human decency and protective instincts. Queen Elizabeth II herself was briefed on the situation and the unprecedented public response it had generated. Royal sources, speaking anonymously, indicated that the monarch was personally moved by the story and concerned about ensuring that the response reflected the values she hoped the palace would represent. Her influence on the final decision would prove significant, though it remained behind the scenes. Emma's parents, who had been working abroad and rushed back to London upon hearing about the incident, met privately with James to express their gratitude. The emotional meeting, though kept out of the media, reinforced James's conviction that he had made the right choice. Seeing the child's recovery and her parents' relief validated his decision to prioritize human welfare over protocol. The international diplomatic community also took notice of the incident, with several ambassadors commenting on how James's actions reflected the best of British values. The story had become a soft power victory for the United Kingdom, demonstrating the nation's commitment to protecting the vulnerable and standing up for what was right. Cultural attachés reported increased positive sentiment toward Britain in their host countries. Child welfare organizations seized on the story as an opportunity to highlight the importance of adult intervention when children are threatened. They organized campaigns featuring James's example to encourage bystanders to act when they witness child abuse or neglect. The Guard's actions had become a teaching tool for promoting child protection awareness globally. As the formal review process approached, it became clear that the decision about James's future would carry implications far beyond one man's career. The palace administration recognized that their response would be seen as a statement about institutional values versus human compassion, with the entire world watching to see which would prevail. The stage was set for a resolution that would either reinforce rigid protocol or acknowledge the higher calling of moral courage. 3 weeks after the incident, James Harrison received an unprecedented summons that would determine not only his future, but also set a new precedent for palace protocol. He was asked to report to the palace's Oak Room, a formal chamber typically reserved for high-level diplomatic meetings and ceremonial occasions. The unusual location for what he had expected to be a standard disciplinary hearing suggested that something extraordinary was about to occur. Captain Morrison accompanied James to the meeting, his usually stern demeanor replaced by an expression of barely concealed pride. The captain had spent considerable time reviewing James's exemplary service record and had concluded that the sergeant's actions, while technically a breach of protocol, represented the finest traditions of military service and human decency. He had prepared a comprehensive recommendation for leniency. Inside the Oak Room, an unexpected assembly awaited them. Senior palace officials sat alongside representatives from the Metropolitan Police, child welfare organizations, and even Mrs. Chen and Emma, who had been invited to participate in what was being called a comprehensive review of the incident and its implications. The formal setting contrasted sharply with the human drama that had brought them all together. Emma, now fully recovered from her physical injuries and showing remarkable resilience, had prepared a drawing for James that depicted a palace guard helping a small girl. Her artwork, created with the help of art therapists who had been working with her, showed her understanding that James had been her protector and hero. The simple crayon drawing would become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in favor of clemency. The Lord Chamberlain, the senior official responsible for the royal household, began the proceedings by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation. Never before had a palace guard's breach of protocol generated such international attention or raised such fundamental questions about the balance between duty and moral obligation. The traditional frameworks for handling such matters seemed inadequate for the complexity of James's case. Testimony from witnesses painted a consistent picture of James's character and the circumstances that led to his decision. Dr. Foster spoke about the importance of immediate intervention in cases of child trauma, explaining how James's quick response had likely prevented more severe psychological damage to Emma. Her medical expertise provided scientific support for the guard's instinctive protective actions. PC. Williams presented the police perspective, noting that James's intervention had been crucial in preventing Marcus Webb's escape and ensuring that justice could be served. She emphasized that without the guard's immediate action, the perpetrator might have disappeared into the London crowd, making prosecution much more difficult. The police testimony reframed James's protocol breach as essential assistance to law enforcement. Mrs. Chen, speaking through a translator, delivered the most emotionally powerful testimony of the proceedings. She described her granddaughter's terror and her own helplessness in that moment, contrasting it with the immediate sense of safety and protection that James's presence had provided. Her words, though filtered through translation, carried unmistakable sincerity and gratitude that moved everyone present. Emma herself was invited to speak, though her young age made formal testimony inappropriate. Instead, she was allowed to present her drawing to James and say a few words about how he had made her feel safe. Her innocent perspective on the incident provided a reminder of what was truly at stake when adults failed to protect children from violence and abuse. The defense of James's actions came not only from external witnesses, but also from within the military hierarchy itself. Several senior officers testified about the guard's exemplary service record, his leadership qualities, and his embodiment of the values that the British military sought to instill in all its members. They argued that his actions, while technically against regulations, represented the highest ideals of service. Captain Morrison's formal recommendation proved to be a masterpiece of military advocacy. He argued that James's decision demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and quick thinking that made him an exemplary soldier and guard. The captain proposed that rather than punishment, James's actions should be studied as an example of how to balance competing loyalties when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The international dimension of the case was addressed by diplomatic representatives who explained how James's story had enhanced Britain's reputation abroad. The incident had become a symbol of British values at their finest, showing the world that even rigid institutions could prioritize human compassion when circumstances demanded it. Cultural attachés reported that the story had generated more positive international coverage than many official diplomatic initiatives. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the Lord Chamberlain called for a brief recess while the decision-makers consulted privately. James used this time to speak quietly with Emma and her grandmother, who had remained throughout the proceedings despite having no obligation to do so. Their presence spoke volumes about their commitment to seeing justice done for the man who had protected them. When the proceedings resumed, the atmosphere in the Oak Room had changed palpably. The Lord Chamberlain's expression suggested that a momentous decision had been reached, one that would have implications far beyond James's individual case. The assembled officials and witnesses waited in tense silence as he prepared to deliver the verdict that the world was watching for. "Sergeant Harrison," the Lord Chamberlain began formally, "your actions on the morning of the incident constituted a clear breach of established protocol for palace guards. However, this panel has concluded that your decision to intervene was not only morally justified, but exemplified the highest values of service, protection, and human decency that we hope to embody as representatives of the Crown." The relief in the room was immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Chen began crying tears of joy, while Emma clapped her hands in excitement despite not fully understanding the formal language being used. Captain Morrison allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction, knowing that his recommendation had been heard and respected by the decision-makers. Furthermore, the Lord Chamberlain continued, "We are implementing immediate changes to palace guard protocols to clarify that protection of the innocent, particularly children in immediate danger, supersedes standard positioning requirements. Your actions will serve as the foundation for new training procedures that emphasize moral courage alongside traditional discipline." The announcement represented a revolutionary change in an institution known for its resistance to modification. James's single moment of moral clarity had not only saved his career, but it also transformed the guidelines that would govern future generations of palace guards. The precedent established would ensure that other guards facing similar situations would have clear authorization to act according to their conscience. James was not only cleared of all charges, but was formally commended for his actions and promoted to the rank of staff sergeant. The promotion came with new responsibilities for training younger guards in the updated protocols that would bear his unofficial influence. His story would become part of the official curriculum for new recruits, ensuring that future palace guards understood their role as protectors of justice, not merely ceremonial figures. The ceremony concluded with an unexpected gesture that brought the entire case full circle. Emma was invited to present James with a special pin, designed by palace artisans, that depicted a guardian figure protecting a child. The pin would become part of his official uniform, a visible symbol of the values that had guided his actions, and the recognition those actions had earned. Marcus Webb, meanwhile, faced the full consequences of his actions in criminal court. He was convicted of assault on a minor and sentenced to community service, anger management counseling, and a substantial fine that was donated to child protection charities. His business reputation never recovered, and he eventually left London, in disgrace, his brief moment of violence having destroyed the life he had built. In the months that followed, James became an inadvertent spokesperson for child protection causes, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of adult intervention when children are threatened. His message was simple but powerful. Protecting the innocent is everyone's responsibility, regardless of their official role or personal convenience. Emma's recovery was complete, both physically and emotionally. The trauma of the attack was overshadowed by the positive outcome of her story and the knowledge that a hero had appeared when she needed one most. She maintained a correspondence with James, sending him drawings and letters that celebrated their special friendship and the day he chose to help her. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The story became a case study in business schools about the consequences of unchecked privilege and anger, while military academies used James's example to teach about moral courage under pressure. The incident had created teaching moments that would influence countless future leaders. Years later, when tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace, guides would tell the story of the day a palace guard proved that human decency could triumph over rigid protocol. The tale,